The first presentation under this session will be given by Dr. Park Bum-soon, who is the director of the Center for Anthropocene Studies at KAIST University. Dr. Park is also a professor at KAIST University at the Graduate School for Science and Technology and Policy. He is the director of the Center for Anthropocene Studies. He looks at policy matters between science and governance from a historical perspective and a comparative perspective. He received a doctorate at Johns Hopkins University and also worked at a postdoc at the NIH. We will now listen to Dr. Park and his presentation. Please give him a warm round of applause.
안녕하십니까. 카이스트 인류세 연구센터의 박범순입니다. 이렇게 귀한 자리에 초청해 주셔서 감사드립니다. 제가 먼저 그 화면 공유를 하겠습니다.
네.
저는 오늘 인류세의 관점에서 무형문화가 왜 중요한지, 그 유산을 어디서 어떻게 찾아볼 수 있을지에 대해서 말씀드리고자 합니다. 인류세라는 용어를 생소하게 느끼실 분도 계실 텐데요. 인류세는 인류의 시대 또는 인류의 세기를 뜻하는 지질학적 용어입니다. 인간의 활동으로 인해 지구의 변화가 마치 대규모 화산 폭발, 운석 충돌에 비견될 정도로 너무 커져서 이제 새로운 지질 시대를 구분해서 봐야 한다는 관점에서 출발했습니다. 이 개념은 대기화학자인 파울 크리촌이 2000년에 제안해서 처음에는 과학계 안에서 퍼지고 이어서 인문사회, 문화예술 여러 분야에 빠르게 퍼졌습니다. 현재 지질학계에서는 이 개념을 공식적으로 채택할 것인지에 대해서 논의하고 있는 중입니다. 오늘 이 자리에서는 기후위기, 생태 파괴 등을 포함한 지구의 행성적 위기를 가르치는 것으로 생각하시면 될 것 같습니다. 이 사진은 아마도 신문지상을 통해 보신 분들이 계실 텐데요. 미국 우주항공국 나사가 지난 1월과 2월 중국 상공에서 온실가스 주범 중에 하나인 이산화 질소의 양을 찍은 것입니다. 확연히 달라진 것을 볼 수 있죠. 이 사진이 주는 메시지는 단순하지만 강합니다.
This photograph presents us with a very clear message where we see that there are these different elements that exist between the organisms and non-organisms, and they can really impact our society and our economy as a whole. Traditionally, when we talk about something that is social, they refer to the interpersonal relationships, human-to-human relationships. But now these non-human elements are impacting these relationships. And let me show you some more photographs that really illustrate this point. This looks like a parking lot for airplanes, which is in fact an airport. And this picture here looks like an actual parking lot, when in fact it's a line of cars of people waiting to receive food at a San Antonio food bank. Many years, even before this coronavirus pandemic, scientists have predicted and warned about this possibility. That's because there was a higher likelihood of a zoonotic disease outbreak due to eco-devastation and global warming. In fact, the UN has said that this COVID-19 outbreak should be seen as an SOS call for human enterprise. And in August, the scientific journal Nature published a paper that describes how these different crises have led to the enormous increase in certain species, such as bats and rats. When exactly is the starting points of the Anthropocene age? And what are its causes? Let me show you some graphs about the starting points of this era. This shows the changes in the Earth's average temperature around the year 1900, especially after 1950. You see this a sudden spike in the temperature. When it comes to global warming, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is key. And it was only after 1958 that we began measuring these levels. As you can see, they are consistently increasing. And there is also an increase in the carbon dioxide in the Earth's oceans, as shown in green. The blue graph shows the acidification of the oceans. It's absolutely clear that these changes are closely linked to economic activity. This graph shows the changes in the UK's GDP from the 13th century to today. And you can see the increase in the 20th century, especially in the later parts of the 20th century, how there's this dramatic increase. So it's in the 1950s that the great acceleration has begun. That's when various Earth system indicators and socioeconomic indicators all display a clear trend. And that's when many scientists are saying that we should set as the starting point of the Anthropocene era. We see erratic climate change patterns, and we see plastics, chicken bones, and radioactive materials found and caught in our geology. Discussions in the Anthropocene are not only held in academia, but also among the public. This is the cover that you see in the UK magazine Economist in 2011. It's a current events magazine, and it says, "Welcome to the Anthropocene." It stresses how we have changed the way the world works, so now we must change the way that we think. How should we change the way we think? Thus far, we experienced modernization, industrialization, urbanization, westernization, and these were accepted universally and were seen as something positive, progressive, and even necessary. The problem is that these processes account for a kind of dichotomous modernity where it's human versus non-human, or life versus non-life, or mind versus body. Furthermore, we've placed nature and culture in a separate category altogether. We have to go beyond this dichotomy of thinking to see nature and culture as one. So in my presentation, I would illustrate some specific examples using the cases of matsutake mushrooms, trees, stones, and fish. Recently, the American anthropologist Anna Tsing wrote a book on matsutake mushrooms. And this book was quite sensational. That's because anthropologists typically deal with humans, villages, or tribes, not a non-human element such as a mushroom. The book starts out in a new light as well. It asks, what would you do if the world were to come to an end? And the author says that she will go for a walk. And if she's lucky, she hopes to find some mushrooms. That's how she begins the discussion. But why mushrooms? In fact, after the Hiroshima nuclear bomb explosion in August 1945, the first life form that returned that autumn were mushrooms. And in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the people of Siberia ate mushrooms to survive. Mushrooms are a sign of hope found in those places where hope seems to be all but lost. Anna Tsing captured upon that idea and presented several concepts that allowed people to see humans and nature as one. Now, many people talk about sustainability, but she suggests the concept of livability. And she also emphasizes our entanglement with other species and non-organisms. And for those coincidental, accidental situations that occur through these entanglements, she refers to as patchiness and multiple temporalities. Let me explain further how Anna Tsing used these concepts. Typically, we think of matsutake mushrooms as those root vegetables that we gather in the mountains, we sell at the market, and later we find them in our foods. Tsing, however, discusses the survival of the species that are entangled here. Wild matsutake mushrooms have always been favored by the Japanese, and Japan has heavily relied on imports of these mushrooms. But after the Chernobyl disaster in 1986, European imports of these mushrooms decreased as they were exposed to radioactivity. Prices skyrocketed. So mushroom merchants began showing an interest in the mushrooms grown in Oregon, a state in the United States. But why Oregon? Anna Tsing visited the state and listened to the mushroom gatherers. Many of these mushroom gatherers were from Laos and Cambodia. They were refugees and migrants. But why Southeast Asians? Singh describes very well the accidental meeting between these mushrooms and Southeast Asians. So in the past, in Oregon, there was this very tall, grand pine tree called the ponderosa. But in the 80s, this tree had almost disappeared and all the lumber companies left. So there was nothing left in these fields except another pine tree species called the lodgepole. And matsutake mushrooms grow very well under these trees. Many of the Southeast Asian people living in these parts were of the Mian ethnicities. The Mian people had ancestors who lived in the mountainous regions of southern China. In the 20th century, they settled in Laos and Thailand. Some of them assisted US soldiers during the Vietnam War and ended up living in Cambodia as refugees after the war. And in the 1980s, they came to the US as refugees. Unable to find work in society, they lived in the mountains of Oregon. And when the matsutake mushrooms began fetching a good price in the 1980s, as I mentioned, many of these Southeast Asian migrants and refugees worked to gather these mushrooms, and this improved their quality of life. And they call the mushrooms white gold. The intangible knowledge and wisdom of survival, of digging for mushrooms and learning not to get lost in the mountains really worked in the favor of these Mian ethnic peoples. Using this example, Singh proposes a third kind of nature. The first kind of nature is ecological. It's very pristine. And the second nature is one that has been shaped by capitalism. And Singh proposes a third kind of nature, and it's where we don't deny or affirm capitalism, but allow nature to exist despite the workings of capitalism. So this is a kind of capitalism without progressive ideology and a capitalism that works to buttress life. Now, this is a new kind of proposal set forth by Anna Singh. So there's another case that also shows how humans and nature can live as one. And this case is found in Nampe. It's found in the southernmost part of Korea. In Nampe, there are 31 protected trees. Most of these trees are designated as protected species because they're very old, hundreds of years old. But they are also protected from storms and other natural disasters and bring people together as one. In fact, some of the villagers call these trees grandpa tree or grandma tree. The Tungsten Festival and the Tug of War game showed this very well. In the first full moon day of the year, based on the lunar calendar, the villagers in the upper village gather by their sacred tree to engage in a memorial rite. And the villagers of the lower village also gather at the other sacred tree in a ritual service. Then they engage in a tug of war game. And this is to celebrate the year's harvest and pray for a full harvest the next year. Villagers can gather and participate in a spirit of goodwill. Recently, an art project titled Guardians of the Village, the Protected Trees of Nampe, was planned, inviting artists and architects to participate. And the description here is very interesting. The protected trees of Nampe are a record of long life and also a connector of the community's wishes to the greater nature. They protect the weak and vulnerable humans from nature. And there's a piece in this exhibition called Branches, where the branches of the trees have been connected. And there's a separate piece in the exhibit show the several portraits of the villagers. These two works show better the connection between humans and nature. Next are the tsunami stones of Japan. After the Fukushima disaster of 2011, the village called Aneyoshi did not suffer any damage from the tsunami. The village of Aneyoshi has many tsunami stones that have been kept across generations. Some are hundreds of years old, so the letters cannot be read, they're not legible, but most of them were set up before the massive tsunami in 1896. There are warnings here that say, do not build any houses below this point. The schools in Anayoshi also teach children about the dangers of tsunamis. You would see that some of the newer ones are built here and kept here next to some of the older stones. Despite that, a large wall was erected by the beach to prevent against future tsunamis, and this is almost completed. So you would see that this is where ancient icy age and modern technology come together. Lastly is the example of the custom of Amazonian indigenous peoples who live in Brazil. And this scene here that you see is from an exhibition held at the Seoul Ilmin Museum last year. It dates back to 2019, and it's titled Dear Amazon, Anthropocene. This scene in particular is from a 2016 documentary by Jonathan G. Andrigi. So it shows here that the indigenous people share a relationship with fish that goes beyond human and human relationship. It's a form of a coexistence. Through this, the artist sought to do away with the stereotypes of a human-centered worldview. So we can consider this when it comes to why intangible cultural heritage is important in the Anthropocene era. Firstly, ICH is important in overcoming the dichotomies in our modern world. For a long time, we have engaged in customs of living together with nature. And we have to think about the actions that are relevant to more than human beings. And the recovery of biodiversity has to do with the preservation of cultural diversity as well. In this part in particular, the recovery of biodiversity is something that the scientists who are calling for the Anthropocene era really believe to be urgent. I think that the keynote speaker has also stressed this in his keynote speech as well. Lastly, I want to stress that ICH can be a huge help in allowing us to sense and detect Anthropocene crises like the climate crisis and figure out alternatives. With that, I would like to end my presentation. Thank you.